This afternoon's event is sponsored by the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning in collaboration with the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies and the Hofberger Family Foundation at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Merkel has very kindly invited me to introduce Dr. Barnett to you this afternoon. When it is Dr. Merkel and his entire staff at the J. Phillips Center that has done all of the work to bring about this wonderful event. I have, however, had the great privilege of studying under the tutelage of Dr. Barnett, and it is an honor for me to acquaint you with her today. Dr. Barnett is one of, perhaps the leading scholar of the Christian churches during the Holocaust. She's also an expert on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. How many people are familiar with that name, Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Jolly good. She's authored 2 books, the first of which, entitled For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler, uses personal interviews and private memoirs to provide an account of the confessing church during the Holocaust. Dr. Barnett's second book, Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, examines the factors that fostered passivity and complicity on the part of ordinary citizens during the Nazi era. She is also the editor and translator of Wolfgang Gerlich's And the Witnesses Were Silent, The Confessing Church as the Jews, as well as the revised edition of Bethke's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a biography. Dr. Barnett, who lived in Germany for about 13 years or so, has edited and translated numerous works originally published in German, including the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works English edition. In itself, a 17-volume, and I think a couple of decades-long project. And as I understand it, Dr. Barnett, I think you, as general editor, edited almost half of the entire collection. That's a mammoth task. In addition, she is the author of numerous, at my last count it was over 70, articles and book chapters on the role of religious leaders and institutions during the Holocaust. She's currently working on a book about the role of international interfaith and ecumenical leaders during the Holocaust, as well as a historical guide to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his writings. And all of this while holding down a full-time job at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. At the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Dr. Barnett is Director of Programs on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust, a position she has now held for over a decade. In that role, one of the many areas she's responsible for includes organizing, leading, or co-leading seminars for seminary and religious studies faculty. It was at 2 such seminars that I became acquainted with Dr. Barnett. The first seminar I took with her focused on the Holocaust and the role of the Christian churches. For the most part, it's not a bright story. The second seminar I examined in particular the shift in Catholic teaching on the Jews since Vatican II. I think that's a very hopeful story. It was the problem of innocent suffering that first led me to Holocaust studies. Dr. Barnett helped me to recognize the Holocaust as a problem for Christianity, and she helped me to become a more responsible teacher of the Holocaust as a result. If there are faculty and staff in the room, I highly recommend that you take a seminar with Dr. Barnett. We're now 70 years out from the horrors of the Shoah, the preferred Hebrew term for what is typically called the Holocaust in English translation. As the survivors, the perpetrators, the resistors, and the complicit bystanders of that horrifying event become fewer and fewer, it is historians like Dr. Barnett who, through their diligent research, their scholarship, and their vocation, help us never to forget. The title of Dr. Barnett's lecture this afternoon is Implications of the Holocaust for Multireligious Conversations. Please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Dr. Vicky Barnett.
Thank you so very much. And thanks to John Merkel and the Phillips Center here at St. John's University. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here and a delight to see so many of the students. I hope this afternoon will be worth your while and interesting. I'm going to start with a story, and it's a story that is surprising and interesting, and when I first came across it, I thought, I have to find out more. In February of 1935, a Reform rabbi from Baltimore, Maryland, Rabbi Morris Lazarin, took an indefinite paid leave from his congregation in Baltimore and sailed to Europe. He put his 2 children in a Swiss boarding school in Lausanne, and he moved to Berlin, Germany, 1935. Lazarin was one of several American Jews during the early years of National Socialism who traveled to Germany. Many of them fact-finding trips trying to really get a first-hand impression of what was actually happening in Nazi Germany, and attempting to help German Jews get visas to the United States. But Lazarin's trip was unique in several respects, because Lazarin wanted to do more. In fact, Lazarin hoped that he could actually help change what was happening in Berlin on the grassroots level, by bringing together German Jews and non-Jews, and among other things, showing the models of the interreligious work that was, at the time, quite successful in the United States. I sometimes joke about this, but it's not really a joke. They were really thinking that they would have potlucks for Jews and Nazis and work on interreligious understanding. Lazarin was part of the interreligious work in this country. He was the national Jewish staff member of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, an organization that was founded in 1928. It gained prominence throughout the 1930s, primarily through its so-called trio tours, in which a priest, a rabbi, and a pastor traveled throughout the United States holding model interreligious dialogues and trying to found local community organizations that would work for interreligious understandings. Their workshops and programs brought together people around the country in the name of tolerance, this was what the word that they used, and pluralistic democracy. The NCCJ was a success story in many ways, with a national profile and a nationwide level of influence. For those of you old enough to remember the Tom Lehrer song, they founded National Brotherhood Week. The NCCJ also founded what is today known as Religion News Service. They held interfaith events at the White House with FDR, and they sponsored the Why We Fight newsreels of the World War II era. The organization went from 2 part-time staffers in 1932 to a national staff of 275 people at 65 regional offices and a $2 million national budget in 1949. In addition, they founded 325 local interreligious committees around the country. Their success was due partly, I would say, to the very savvy entrepreneurship of their director, the Reverend Everett Clinchy, and partly due to the fact that they were able to seize a moment in the history of this country, one in which American Catholics and Jews who had reached a certain degree of integration in American society, but were deeply concerned about continued anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, wanted to work with mainline Protestants to fight these evils. The NCCJ stayed away from theological dialogue, rather instead emphasizing the importance of common social ground. Whoops. I'm sorry, I knew this would happen. The NCCJ platform was that prejudice in all of its forms undermined the essential values of American democracy, and that Catholics, Jews, and Protestants needed to work together to fight this prejudice, whatever their theological differences. The only theological step they took early on, and for that era it was quite significant, was the outright repudiation of the evangelization and conversion of Jews to Christianity, because that was what was necessary if Jews were really going to become involved in this work. And that perspective, interreligious work in the name of broader pluralism and democratic values, was the lens through which the NCCJ viewed what was happening in Nazi Germany. The NCCJ believed that democracy was the antidote to prejudice. Everett Clinchy actually made 4 trips to Germany during the 1930s, and his early interpretation of what was happening there was that it was what he called an intergroup conflict, similar to the tensions between right-wing American groups like the Ku Klux Klan and their targets. He didn't see it as the persecution of the Jewish minority in Germany. American Jewish leaders were already seeing the situation in Nazi Germany quite differently. But before he got to Germany, Lazarin himself thought that the NCCJ approach that had succeeded so well in the United States in fighting anti-Semitism might work in Germany. As he wrote his colleague, the American Jewish philanthropist Max Warburg, shortly before his departure for Germany, and I quote at some length from his letter to Warburg because it gives us a glimpse of how he thought, he says, "My goal, of course, is clear. It is really the second emancipation of the Jews. All these matters are going through my mind, and I think the time is here to set in motion a study of the practical possibilities of the situation. What is done in Germany will have implications for the status of the Jew throughout the continent, especially in Middle and Eastern Europe. No more delicate task faces any Jew in the world today. The man who undertakes it must be persona non grata with all groups. He must be able to envisage the Jewish situation in the general setting. He may not allow his Jewish feelings, no matter how keenly they may be involved, to distort the general picture. He certainly must know when to speak, to whom to speak, what to say, and how to say it. And he must know how to talk with people. That, of course, is a large order, and I'm not at all sure that I can do the job, but at least I would like to try." In other words, Lazarin was hoping to be a mediator. He arrived in Berlin in mid-February, and within days, he was in a state of shock. The nature of his stay in Berlin changed dramatically. He had gone to Berlin not just on behalf of the NCCJ, but also the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And once Jews in Berlin heard that there was an American rabbi in town, Lazarin was besieged by people who desperately hoped they could get an American visa. He also met secretly with members of the Confessing Church. In fact, when he returned to the United States, he gave a number of talks about what was happening to the churches in Germany. He consulted regularly with Ambassador Dodd, and he met with Jewish leaders in Berlin. He had to be cautious in his letters from Germany, but on a trip to Italy in April 1935, he wrote, "It is utterly useless to attempt any liaison with the present regime. My work is clear: to stay here as long as I can, absorb as much information as possible, and feed it to Christian as well as Jewish sources to keep the question alive." And once he returned to the United States in June 1935, he wrote Jewish leader Paul Berwald, "No one who has seen what I've seen and heard what I've heard can ever be quite the same. It is a searing but sobering thing to go down into the abyss. Our people don't really know, deeply comprehend what it's all about, what is at stake. A malignant force has been set loose in the world against us." The story of Lazarin's brief stay in Berlin from February till the end of May is fascinating for many reasons, but I would note 2 very striking aspects. The first is that it reminds us that people at the time, even good people, didn't see clearly what was happening in Nazi Germany until they saw it firsthand. Morris Lazarin had to go to Berlin to realize the nature of what he was looking at, and to realize that the situation in Nazi Germany was fundamentally different from what was happening in the United States. The second aspect is that when Lazarin returned to the United States, he received a very different reception among his Christian interreligious colleagues than within the Jewish community. Once Lazarin had experienced firsthand what German Jews were going through, he felt a personal sense of fear and vulnerability that his Christian colleagues in the NCCJ did not. I should emphasize that nonetheless these colleagues, primarily ecumenical and interreligious leaders, were essentially one among the few groups during this era to respond decisively to what was happening in Nazi Germany, notably but not only in the wake of the November 1938 pogroms, so-called Kristallnacht, and that the strongest condemnations of anti-Semitism in that era that came from this country came from these circles. I would include the 1939 Presbyterian condemnation of anti-Semitism, the 1942 Federal Council of Churches statement condemning what they described of was the outright massacre of the European Jews, and yet in Europe, a joint Jewish-Christian statement in March 1943 by ecumenical leaders and the World Jewish Congress. So there was concern, and there were certainly some reactions, but most of these were within a very much larger framework that was driven by American concerns at the time and very much driven by an approach which was highlighted in the NCCJ that was characterized by mediation and the search for common ground. For that reason, over the course of the 1930s, many American Jewish leaders came to dismiss the NCCJ because of its weakness on the issue of Nazism. Lazarin stayed involved, and he kept believing in the NCCJ agenda for this country. But as his letters show, there was a deep sense of anguish about what was happening in Europe and a growing frustration with some of his colleagues. The story of Lazarin's trip and the larger issues I've just laid out tells us something about the nature of interreligious relationships and work, especially in times of great political turbulence and contention. Historically, I would say there are two distinct kinds of interreligious engagement, and they often draw distinct groups of people. The first is theological, and that's often the first one we think of. Members of different faiths coming together to learn about each other and to learn from one another and to try to eradicate misunderstandings about one another. Sometimes such conversations specifically address theological teachings that have been the source not just of misunderstanding, but actual violence and persecution, as in the case of the Jewish-Christian dialogues that came out of the Holocaust, as Christians confronted their own teachings and the interpretations of Judaism that had laid the foundation for the Holocaust. The second kind of interreligious work is what defined the NCCJ and much interfaith work today. Interreligious work as a platform for people to work together for the common good. It's coalition building. It's bridge building. It's looking at what we have in common as opposed to the differences between traditions. And as a result, it's often the case, as in the NCCJ, that the theological issues are put aside in the interests of the greater cause. But in both kinds of conversations, there are, in fact, always three simultaneously occurring conversations that are constantly interacting, pushing at one another, and often exist in tension. The first is the direct dialogue with the other, the Jews and the Christians who sit down around the table speaking to one another directly about their concerns. One of the NCCJ's model programs, the TRIO tour I mentioned, was a model of this, having a rabbi, a priest, and a Protestant clergyman in conversation where they spoke to one another about their differences, but also their common goals. Then there's a second level of conversation, the background conversation that each of these partners is in fact having with their respective traditions. Sometimes that conversation is in their own mind. The Jew says, I think all Christians believe this way, and the Christian thinks, well, but wait a minute, I don't think I do. So that's an internal one, but sometimes there are actually conversations or ongoing, conversations between members of the community. Morris Lazarin was not only in dialogue with his Christian colleagues, but with his own Jewish community, and the same was true of his Catholic and Protestant colleagues. Each community brought its own concerns, its priorities, often critically, to bear on the direct interreligious conversations, sometimes pushing back against the first kind of dialogue. And then there's the larger conversation in which both partners are in fact engaging with a bigger issue, whether that issue is Nazi Germany. And other issues that the NCCJ spent a great deal of time focused on in the 1930s were the Spanish Civil War, which was of huge concern to the Catholic population. Domestic concerns in the United States like unemployment. After 1939, the issues of the Second World War. On this level, too, the three different faith communities took different positions that often affected the other levels of dialogue. The interplay between these three levels of dialogue is what pushes the conversation forward, but it's also what can stall it in its tracks. The interplay is what leads to actual change within a tradition. One of the things we see after 1945 in the wake of the Holocaust is a new kind of Christian-Jewish conversation that is pushing for a change within Christianity with regard to teachings about the Jews. And in one way, it culminates in Vatican II, in Nostra Aetate, the statement that led to a new phase in Catholic-Jewish relations, which would not have happened without the background of all these different kinds of conversations. So interreligious work has always been not just about the immediate topic at hand, but about changing a larger discourse, about changing the culture, about pushing the culture to a new level, a critical mass that can actually bring about change in terms of laws, structures, relationships, and hopefully, ultimately, in the way people actually think and view one another, and in what they believe. The NCCJ, in many ways, was a success story for its times. It helped create a workable pluralism in the United States, a tri-faith America, as the term went, and yet Will Herberg's classic 1955 book, Protestant Catholic Jew, showed that there were still deep divisions that remained in the midst of this pluralism, because the process also uncovered the built-in fault lines in interreligious work, the different historical perspectives and experiences, the vulnerabilities that lead to very different perspectives on a given situation, showing how interreligious dialogue, rather than solving differences, sometimes just reveals them. Lazaren's experience in Germany, and indeed the experiences of American Jews throughout the 1930s and 1940s, shows the painful tension between their genuine commitment to working toward the big picture issues of interreligious understanding and their growing sense that their own concern about antisemitism and the persecution of the Jews in Europe were not being taken seriously enough by their dialogue partners. How are these issues relevant to our understanding of the Holocaust and its possible implications for the multi-religious, not just interreligious, scene in this country today? In a sense, what I've been describing are inevitable tensions between addressing the particulars of an event and its more universal applications. The particulars of the Holocaust include the very intentional, deliberate, planned targeting of a specific group, the Jews, with prejudice, violence, and ultimately mass murder on an almost incomprehensible scale. The universals are what I call the bigger questions: the human capacity for evil, hatred, and violence against other human beings. Those bigger questions are not unique to the Holocaust. Every historical case of genocide grapples with them, even if the circumstances of each case are somewhat different. The most effective interreligious work is that which somehow manages to connect both these sets of issues, the universals and the particulars. The persecution of any minority raises questions not just about attitudes toward a particular group, but larger questions about how we frame our life together in society, in civil society, and globally, and how we can prevent such violence from defining us and from spreading. The case of Morris Lazaren and the NCCJ illustrates how difficult it is for a group to do justice to both the particular and the universal issues. If you look at the history of interreligious work, what you often find are two distinct groups of people, two different distinct agendas, and two separate bodies of literature in many cases, with some overlap, of course, but it's rather striking. There are exceptions. I think of the late Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had a remarkable gift for speaking for both sets of issues. But by and large, this division is certainly true when we look at the post-Holocaust trajectory of interreligious dialogue. There is today a large and significant body of literature on the Christian-Jewish relationship before and after the Holocaust, which addresses the teaching of contempt, the many centuries of persecution of Jews, the manifold ways in which Christians were responsible for the suffering of Jews both before, after, and during the Holocaust. This has been largely a theologically driven project, and it fits within the first category of interreligious work I described, those theological conversations, in this case between Jews and Christians, that grapple with the hard issues and leading to understanding, reconciliation, respect, and longer-term change within the tradition, in this case, changes in Christian teachings about Judaism. Post-Holocaust Christian-Jewish dialogue focus on the particulars of the Holocaust, the centuries-long, deeply embedded culture and rhetoric of anti-Semitism that began in the early days of the church, continuing well into the 20th century. The pioneers, the church leaders, the theologians, educators, and others who engaged in these kinds of conversations and developed this new theological approach are a distinct group of people. I would include John Merkel, who's director of the Phillips Center here, other such centers around the country, people who have been engaged now for several decades in Abrahamic dialogues. Today, as our society becomes more diverse and new issues are coming onto the table, these dialogues and the work of many centers is expanding to include Muslims and others. And in the process, not just the content, but some of the methodologies and the divisions I'm talking about are changing. The second trajectory that came out of the Holocaust focused less on the dialogical and more, I would say, on the big issues, the political issues that emerged out of the Holocaust. This is where we would find political theologians such as the late German theologian Dorothee Sölle. And many of the ecumenical leaders of the era went in this direction as well. They sought to address the legacy of the Holocaust in ways that went beyond the particulars of the history of the theological history of Christians and Jews and confronted us with more universal dilemmas, the human propensity for violence and evil against people who are not part of our group, the ways in which human beings become complicit in evil, the ways in which we dehumanize other human beings, and the systemic and political issues that invariably emerge when we reach this level of analysis. These are not issues that arose only in the Holocaust. They don't arise simply in cases of genocide. They come up again and again, each time in a somewhat different form and set of circumstances. So one of the important reasons for such scholarship is to see the broader patterns in these kinds of events. On this level, people from very different groups, faiths, and nationalities can begin to look at the particularities of each event. It's through that broader door that they may, in fact, discover empathy with a particular group and come to recognize its suffering. Over the years in my work at the Holocaust, I've worked with a number of international groups who go through the museum, and I found again and again that it's often through that broader door that they suddenly realized the particular significance of the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews of Europe, and begin perhaps for the first time to wrestle with the issue of anti-Semitism. But as Morris Lazarin discovered, it can also be the case that specific concerns are brushed aside in the quest for the bigger picture. The inherent danger of interreligious work is to rush to the universals, because quite frankly, that's an easier place to be. And more importantly, it's also the place where you can build bridges. But it's also the place where victims may become mere symbols of something bigger. And the particularities of their victimization, the prejudices against them, and their fate are brushed aside, minimized, in a way dehistoricized. Lazarin, when he returned to the United States, found that many of his Catholic colleagues were willing to talk about anti-Semitism only if anti-Catholicism got equal time. And the NCCJ, in its pamphlets about Nazi Germany, framed the issues always on a much bigger canvas. As Lazarin discovered firsthand, people often don't see the nature of what they're looking at. And so what is needed, thinking back to my 3 levels of dialogue, is a kind of process or relationship that attends to the important balance between the particulars and the universals, not distorting the one in the quest for the other, a process in which the 2 levels of conversation become an important corrective for one another. I think good historiography, especially the recover of lost or surprising stories and the discovery of new pieces of the puzzle, can serve as a corrective as well. So I'd like to conclude today by describing a remarkable new area of research that I think will be increasingly important for today's multireligious discussions of the event. Most of the most of the historiography about the church's role through the Nazi era understandably focused on the failures of churches as well as the theological issues. We need much more work on the history of interfaith work, especially during the Holocaust, especially with respect to the phenomenon of genocide. We need more analysis not just of the theological underpinnings, but of the kind of work that the NCCJ did and the role of religion in peacemaking mediation. This kind of work is growing in the field of Holocaust studies because of the growing body of research that has been done on the Holocaust's impact on other religious groups, especially in North Africa. In recent years, the Holocaust Museum has acquired a great deal of archival material from North Africa, notably Morocco and Tunisia, giving historians a more detailed picture of the occupation in those countries, as well as an up-close glimpse of the fabric of relationships that existed at the time between Jews and Muslims. We also have the International Tracing Service records of the International Red Cross, which after 1945 acquired all the documentation maintained by the Nazis on all levels, from Gestapo and police records of German towns to records that were maintained by the Red Cross in all the camps to the post-1945 records of displaced person camps. These records are fascinating because they're really showing us for the first time the diversity that existed in Europe before the Holocaust and the diversity of people who became victims of Nazi expansion and brutality. Polish towns in which Muslim Tatars and Polish Jews had lived for centuries before 1933. Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists who become prisoners in the camp system. Stories of rescue and relationship and collaboration. The new research being done is revealing stories and histories that begin to get us thinking differently about these bigger issues. I'll close with one such example, the scholarship currently being done by a Moroccan-born anthropologist named Omar Boum, who now teaches at UCLA. He was a visiting fellow at the museum several years ago, where he did a great deal of research in our North African material. And his book based on this research is called Memories of Absence, Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco, which was published just last year. But his current research is also based on material he found in our archives, and it's about the records of the International League Against Antisemitism, LICA, which was founded in the 1920s by a French Jew named Bernard Lakash, the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants to France. Lakash wanted to raise awareness about the issue of anti-Semitism and get Jews and non-Jews to work together to combat it, somewhat similar to what we see happening in the NCCJ. In the 1930s, he became very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in the French colonial countries of North Africa, especially in Algeria, and with growing violence against Jews in those countries. And so LICA established branches in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and began reaching out to Muslims throughout the region in their concerns about the rise in Arab nationalism and attacks on Jews throughout the region. In 1937, an Egyptian writer, Hamid al-Maliji, published a pamphlet warning Muslims about the dangers of National Socialism. While Muslims, he wrote, might think that they shared common cause with the Nazis in their fight against Jews, and the Nazis were certainly working at this point to convince Muslims of that common cause. The fundamental racism of National Socialism meant, al-Hamiji wrote, that they would finally target Muslims as well, and he argued that Nazi ideology was inherently anti-Islamic. One of the more stunning documents that Omar Boum found in our archives was a 52-page translation of excerpts from Mein Kampf into Arabic, published in 1939 by an Algerian journalist, Abdurrahmani Fitravi. It consisted of material that in the official Arabic translation of Mein Kampf, which the Nazis were disseminating, the Nazis had left out, namely the sections of Mein Kampf where Hitler wrote that Arabs were inferior, that they lacked culture and civilization, and he portrayed them as barbarians. The pamphlet included a startling drawing of Hitler and Mussolini trampling on a copy of the Quran. Al-Maliji, in his pamphlet, included a bibliography of other German works on race and Aryan supremacy that had been translated into Arabic with a critique of each book. In 1940, after the Germans occupied Paris, the Gestapo closed the offices of Leica. Bernard Lacache had to flee, and he went to Algiers, where he continued to find allies throughout North Africa in his work and continued to try to build alliances. In many respects, Leica's work during this year was similar to the approach we see taken by the NCCJ. It emphasized that any kind of prejudice might begin with one group of victims, but it inevitably would reach the others. It tried to build alliances focused on the big bridge issues of economic and political integration, and it argued that focusing on a particular form of prejudice, in this case anti-Semitism, showed how it was a threat to the fabric of society and a threat to something much bigger. To some extent, Leica succeeded, and some of the alliances that they were able to create continued into the 1950s. In many ways, however, and for various reasons, there were constant pressures that made these Muslim-Jewish alliances difficult. Maurice Lazarin was an American religious leader. Bernard Lacache, Hamid al-Maliji, and Abdurrahman Fitravi were not. But the latter were faithful Muslims. And their stories, I think, illustrate something worthy of reflection as we think about the Holocaust's implication for multi-religious issues today. When the proponents and perpetrators of violence, war, injustice, and prejudice draw upon religion to justify their causes, we should certainly correct the distortions of the different religions being talked about. But there's always a larger conversation into which all these aspects feed, and it's equally important to understand the dynamics of that larger conversation and the multiple voices we find there. There was a group of Muslims in North Africa in the 1930s and 1940s who viewed National Socialism through a lens not dissimilar to what Maurice Lazarin and his NCCJ colleagues saw, through a lens that emphasized civil liberties, the fight against prejudice, and a commitment to what religious voices can bring. Scholars of the Holocaust have to a great extent overlooked the existence of these people and their perspective, but this new research, I think, is showing us that all of this new material gives us a more accurate picture of what was happening on the ground at the time and at the scope of religious responses to the Holocaust as it was unfolding. This is important because the Holocaust today is very often taught in courses about larger issues: contemporary genocide, Jewish-Christian relations, other fields that approach the history of the Holocaust through their particular lens. But it's in the particulars of the history, the work of groups like NCCJ or the work of people like Bernard Lacache, that enable us to get an accurate picture through that larger lens. So the tension between the universal and the particular is not just a characteristic of interreligious dialogue. It's a necessary and fruitful aspect of academic work in general. I personally have found in my work at the museum, not just with people like Omar Boom who are doing research, but with the very different interreligious and international groups who come to the museum. I'm often the person who gives them a tour and a debriefing, and I often find that when I look at this history together with them, we soon reach a very different kind of conversation that is in many ways very profound. If they are open to this history at all, they are discovering something different, something unexpected, something that some of them didn't necessarily know much about. But they're finding through that a connection to the persecution of another group can be a step to understanding what it means to be a citizen in their own context, of what it means to engage in civil society as a member of a faith group, a member of a minority, of what it really means if you try to stand together against hatred. It really is a place in which I would say the particulars and the universals converge. And it can be a place where if people are willing to put aside certain presuppositions or existing tensions, they may find that this brings the conversation to a much deeper understanding, not just of the history they're looking at, but of the challenges we face today. Thank you so much for your attention. I think we have time for questions. Or not.
Would you like to come down and use the mic? Thank you.
Hi, I just have a question on interreligious dialogue. For the common person, what should we strive for or be realistic about when it comes to interreligious dialogue? Is it enough to engage with your partner, your husband, or your wife? Is it about engaging with another religious group within your community, or should we be looking at things on a larger scale? Just where do you start, or how far do you take it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you start wherever you are. I don't know what's going on here at St. John's, what's going on in your family, what's going on in your community, but there are always places where one can get involved. And the interesting thing is that you can't predict where this will end up, but once you get involved in something, it begins to follow its own course and will lead you somewhere.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, you had mentioned the attempts for interfaith dialogue in North Africa during the occupation of Germany. How is the interfaith dialogue now in North Africa post-Holocaust, as well as interfaith dialogue in Europe post-Holocaust?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's a very complicated one. And I think we need to, I would say, let's start in 1945 in the immediate wake of the Holocaust, where many of these networks still existed, and certainly in Europe. You really began to have several decades of very active Christian-Jewish dialogue that specifically focused on the issues raised by the Holocaust. As I just told the young man, things, when you start in something like this, it always leads elsewhere or leads further. And so many of these groups continue to work together on broader issues as the decades pass. Now, I'm not an expert on the material on North Africa. I mean, I'm just sort of relating what another expert, Omar Boom, has been working on. Omar says that these circles continued into the 1950s. The situation in North Africa today has changed so profoundly that I don't think there's really any interreligious dialogue on the ground simply because of the mass social change, the violence. At the same time, on an international level, in the past 10 to 15 years, you do have international meetings and dialogues at which you find people from Tunisia, Morocco, sometimes states such as Saudi Arabia, Yemen, other places, who come and meet elsewhere, meeting together as Muslims and Jews. I mean, there is sort of a supranational interchange that has been going on now for some time. I don't know how significant that is in terms of the issues on the ground, and I suspect that it doesn't have much of an impact given the political realities that are at work today. But thanks for that question. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Other questions for Dr. Barnett?
Is this on? About a year ago, I was at a conference and I met a colleague from Albania, and he started educating me on the rescue of the Jews by Muslims in Albania. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that you could share with us.
Yeah, I'm not an expert. I just know what I've read, and there's a wonderful film actually called Besa, which looks at the rescue of one Jewish family in Albania by Albanian Muslims. There's a lot of research now being done on Muslim rescues of Jews, not just in Albania, but in other parts of Europe. And one of the things that it's made me realize, and this was something I really had never thought about because I assumed it didn't exist, was, as I said, Muslim-Jewish life in Europe before 1933, in which you really had friendships, communities living together. We have a really interesting film at the museum that was made in 1931 in a Polish village in which you had Tatars, who were Muslims, living with Christians and Jews in a village. And the filmmaker went in and made a film of everyone sort of in the town marketplace, so you really do see the interaction. And then he filmed the local mosque, the Talmudic school, all the different religious, everything. So it's an interesting glimpse. And I think that all of these pieces of research are really important. In part, they help, reduce stereotypes that exist against different groups and show that there was a relationship there. They have to go hand in hand, I would say, with the larger historiography, which shows rescue of Jews, but also collaboration. I mean, you see similar patterns, in fact, among Muslim populations that you see among Christian populations, where you have Christian rescuers of Jews as well as people collaborating. So, it just shows the diversity of the experience, but it's something that is really, really interesting. There's now a woman at Manhattan College, Dr. Manaz Afridi, who's a Muslim woman from Pakistan, and she's the first Muslim director of a Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center, and her work has been on looking at the Shoah through Muslim eyes. I think her book is coming out next year, but she's been dealing a lot with these kinds of issues.
When people try to be kind to each other, we sometimes have to figure out new wrinkles. Thank you very much, Dr. Barnett, for this fine presentation and for some of the ideas that I must follow up on if I can remember to do it. I'm such a geezer now, I forget too much. When I was a professor active in the classroom, I had the privilege of teaching courses that included large sections on Judaism and on Jewish Christian things, and I also began taking people abroad, and my own travel made me aware of several things that I didn't know about by living in Minnesota. When I grew up in northern Minnesota, which is not the end of the world, but as the saying goes, you can see it from there, we had people coming through our territory in the Red River Valley who were called Mexicans. There were people coming through who were called well, they weren't quite sure whether they were Syrians or Lebanese, but they knew they were some funny people, and they were different from us, whoever the us was. And there were some Jews who lived in the area, but usually had jewelry stores or the restaurant or something. And mostly we were a very, very mixed community, and we were pretty much recognized that living together, we had to be neighbors together or none of us would make it in those hard times. So in the 1930s and 40s, I thought maybe other people like myself sort of knew people as national backgrounds rather than religious groups. That's one thing. As a professor and an everlasting student, I continued to study a great deal. And some of the things I found leave living conflicts in my understanding. People see things from one side or from another side. When I first went to a Nazi concentration camp outside of Munich, I discovered that what I had carried as a great personal guilt as an American, as a Christian, as a scholar and teacher, this great personal guilt of this Christian sin of antisemitism and our letting that happen to our Jewish sisters and brothers was only partially true. There, in that camp, I learned that that thing had all been signed, sealed, delivered before I was born. And that made a difference. And I also learned from the records there that it wasn't just Jews. It was, homosexuals. It was priests who were found offensive to the administrators. And largely there was a great medical experimentation going on there. This was about racism and racial cleansing. And I talked to some doctors in Germany who knew full well about this. So I'm beginning to realize it's more of a racism than I had realized. Always keep in mind that the Shoah is about the religious aspect of Jews. But then I also learned by study that the Gypsies, that was the name that was used in this country, others used Roma and so on, but Gypsies were systematically exterminated, and we now know, by careful studies, or at least it was published that we know it, that they were percentage-wise wiped out greater percentage of the people than Jews in Europe. Well, we almost never hear about these things, so I was so glad when you said, if we learn that it's happening to one, it's probably going to be happening to another people. But I'm kind of wondering, my memory, if it's wrong, please correct any part of this. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the last time I was there, I think I learned from staff there that after 50 years, they had acknowledged the vast decimation of the Gypsy population. Is the Holocaust Museum in this country also doing the studies on the killing of the Gypsies and what happened to that community, or is that not being studied?
Yes. I mean, that's part of our permanent exhibition, and we've had several conferences and scholars, research scholars, looking at the issue of the persecution of the Roma. Historians in general, I would say, see the Roma, the persecution and murders of the Roma as the only group that is targeted in a similar way as the Jews of Europe were, that the Nazis wanted and sought to eradicate both populations. While other people are victimized, it's not with that wholesale intent of really eradicating them, but the Roma were certainly targeted in that way. And we talk about that in our exhibition, as well as in some of our programs. When we have the annual Days of Remembrance at the museum, which was just last week on Yom HaShoah, we have every day a reading in our Hall of Remembrance of the names of victims of the Shoah, and there are different lists we have of names, but that includes names of Roma who perished in the Holocaust.
I think I remember when I visited the museum in D.C. that it said that there were about 250,000 Jews in Germany in about 1935.
I think it was about 600,000, yeah.
But so most of the 6 million Jews that were murdered did not come from Germany, but from Poland and Austria and Ukraine, the most Catholic countries in Europe. Is that true?
Yeah, they came from, most of the Jews in Europe who were murdered, and this was because this was where they lived, were in Eastern Europe. The Jews were about 10% of the population of Poland before 1933, which explains the larger numbers. The Jewish population of Germany was quite small. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Quite a bit of emphasis, perhaps disproportionately so, in interfaith dialogue and in Holocaust history is put on this moral, religious failure of the church, so to speak. And what seems to get lost in the shuffle or taken for granted is a moral failure of the German military, a foregone conclusion that soldiers simply follow orders and do what they are told. Rabbi Leo Beck was a chaplain in World War I in the Kaiser's army. Franz Rosenzweig, who died before the Shoah, nearly converted to Catholicism, but during World War I has a Jewish epiphany that maybe that's not such a great idea, was an enlisted man. Where was the protest among the German senior officers that this was a patriotic betrayal? And historically, why isn't the question being asked more often as to why, for instance, the German chaplaincy department doesn't say, wait a minute, rabbis imams, etc., were with us there in the trenches.
You mean the chaplaincy in the First World War?
Correct. That's
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that the German career military, to a very great extent throughout the 1930s, you find them following their career track and being in agreement with a great deal of the Nazi project. In particular, its desire to reclaim territory lost in the First World War, the resurrection of national pride, the expansionism of the Reich, all these sort of things that were actually aspects of Nazi ideology that people bought into. There was a great deal of anti-Semitism. So I think that when we look at the behavior of the military in the Second World War, and I don't myself have a clear sense of the extent to which you have officers who begin to see this as very repugnant. When they go into the East and atrocities begin to be conducted by German soldiers, there are definitely people who found it repugnant. I mean, I've seen case studies and letters, and some of the people who end up in the German resistance, of course, come from this direction. But I don't have the sense that it's a large number. And it goes on for some time. And in the wake of the Holocaust in German historiography, of course, for a long time the argument was that the people who really perpetrated these atrocities were sort of the SS elite, and not the normal Wehrmacht. And then, in the course of the 1980s and 1990s, you have German historians looking at the Wehrmacht and realizing that they were involved in this as well. It's a great question. Why isn't the protest there? Why aren't people who have a certain code of honor as military officers? And in Prussia, they really did have sort of a Prussian code of honor that they were quite proud of. And it was literally torn out of the book of the soldier code during the 1930s. They weren't expected to hold to that. So it really was a revision in many ways of basic military ethics. It's one reason why the museum does a lot of work with people who attend U.S. military academies. They come to the museum to discuss things like military ethics and how one should behave. And in Germany, after 1945, that kind of training became part of training as well, precisely because of the issues that came up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're about out of time, but thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.